All right, welcome back. The last thing we need to, or well, I should say the next thing we need to talk about, in this video series for this week is dialogues. Now, dialogues are a common thing. You've probably run into them many times as you've used applications where we can bring up a modal, or sometimes they're non-modal docs, but by default, usually a dialogue should be a modal thing. You know, the whole point is that you're bringing up and you're distracting the user, and you're disrupting whatever it is they're doing. So we want to do it only when it matters. But it allows us to inform users about something that's really important, and it requires a decision or maybe a choice or something from the user. Material design guidelines will give us some things to keep and remember. For example, a dialogue, because they're by design so interruptive to the user, we want to be really careful to only use them sparingly when something else doesn't make sense. You'll use them, you'll encounter them, so I've tried to come up with places where you'll have to do some in your homework assignment so you can practice it. But by default, remember this about dialogues. First off, they need to be focused, okay? Because they're going to pull whatever your user's in the middle of doing. That dialogue pull is going to pop up, and it's going to distract them. It's going to stop them from seeing whatever they're doing. So it needs to be focused. It needs to be to the point. It needs to be direct. Give them what little pieces of information they need to know to make a decision, and then enable them to make a decision. Now, dialogues also should be helpful. They should be in response to something the user has done, or providing some content with that maybe they need to make a decision. For example, like if the user pressed delete, then a dialogue would make sense now to provide confirmation because it's critical and it's in response to something they have done. Now, the way you design it should be focused and direct. So, for example, in fact, here's a good guideline here of when to use it. Some guidelines, if it's whether we use dialogues, a banner, or a stack bar, depending on what's going on. And there's some great documentation about what those are if you need a little bit more help. But if we look here, we can see here's an alert dialog. It's going to come up and say some text and allow them to make a choice. Discard draft. Now notice the text isn't saying yes or no. When we choose actions in dialog boxes, this is one of my favorite parts about material design actually, is don't use yes or no. Okay? Rather, the action attached to the buttons should be somewhat descriptive of what you're asking the user to do. So for example, if they're discarding a draft, instead of saying yes, use the word discard because that's the action. Or maybe you're deleting something. Okay, well then delete or cancel or or something else along those lines. But notice they don't say yes or no. Your action is tied to the behavior you're asking your user to take. That's that urgent behavior we're wanting them to choose from. So that it makes making those decisions a lot less confusing for the user. They don't have to wonder what's going to happen when they click it. They're less likely to choose the wrong thing by chance, etc. You can see a series of dialog boxes. There's an alert dialog, a simple dialog, like something they call it a confirmation dialog. Where you can make a choice. Oftentimes you'll see people call those list dialogues. And then there's full screen dialogues. And we'll get into those full screen dialogues in another week. But a dialogue itself, if we look at the anatomy of a dialogue, it consists of 5 basic components. Okay, number 1 is the container. That's this whole white thing right here, this whole white box that contains the alert or the dialogue itself. Number 2 is the title. Now, a title is not required, but it makes sense a lot of times for your users to have a title that gives them, some quick context to what the rest of the dialogue is saying. Number 3 is supporting text. Now that should always be present. You at least at a minimum should always have a title or supporting text. Never rely just on buttons. That is a terrible decision. But usually the preference is supporting text, title, and then buttons. So we always need at least a supporting text. Supporting text and a title is really good, and then buttons we have to have. Our buttons are these guys down here, and again, we already talked about the verbiage applied to those. And then the last piece, and Android handles this for you, is what we call a scrim. Now, a scrim is this showed by this gray box. The idea is dialogues, because they require the user to make a decision, they have to be modal. And a scrim, by graying out everything behind it, will imply to the user, you've got to focus on this, make some kind of a decision, and then it will go away from there. Now, we can choose whether the user can back out of it and this, the whole thing goes away, or the user taps in the scrim and then the dialogue disappears, or we can force them to make a decision. Those are all decisions you can make as a developer based on the behavior for your dialogue. But we'll always have these 5 basic pieces when we make our dialogue box. And then they've got some great discussion on how do we make a good dialogue. For example, a title should be clear, should be, of what's going to be happening. For example, are you sure is ambiguous because it doesn't, it requires them now to have to read this whole thing to try to figure out what's going on. Rather, the title should be a quick statement. So the question is, can we use your location service? Agree or disagree? Our buttons can be side by side. We can also do top buttons. We try to avoid stacked full width buttons from there, just because again, if you're that wordy, you might want to see if there's a less wordy way you can come up with it. And then there's a lot more information here that I'll let you guys get into on your own to go ahead and look through the dialogues. I'll link to this in Canvas if you got to this page. But that's the basic idea of what a dialogue is. And they've got all sorts of information here you can go through, on theming and specs and sizing them and all those other pieces. But rather, let's focus in on how do we use an alert dialogue. That's the part we're going to focus with today. And I'm going to talk about how we implement one of those and then how we work with it. Now, when we're working with alert dialogues, we are going to put those in what we call a dialogue fragment. Now, the reason we want to use dialogue fragments rather than just firing the dialogues themselves with a builder directly in the fragment you already have or directly from the activity is reuse of those dialogues becomes incredibly difficult. Now, that reuse can apply to being used in multiple places or even being used in the same fragment. We should in general rather use fragments. Now, because that also then enables the entire life cycles to those alerts to be taken place, allows the operating system to better manage its memory and its resources. Say, for example, if a dialogue's on screen and the user gets a phone call, your application's interrupted. Now that dialogue will be managed as a life cycle by the operating system rather than you having to try to remember to pull it back up and rebuild yourself. It just simplifies your life substantially. So we're going to need to make a dialogue fragment for us to work with. So let's go ahead and do that. Oh, my headphones just got stuck. There we go. We're going to come up and choose New. Okay, fragment. But in this case, we're going to change just a couple of pieces here. Okay. So just like we've done in the past, let's go ahead and give it a name. We're going to do a little bit more though this time. Like for example, let's call this delete confirmation dialogue fragment. Notice the piece here of dialogue fragment. The naming gets a little bit more intelligent. We are going to get rid of a factory method, and we're going to get rid of our callbacks. We don't need those, just like we've done every time else in the past. We're going to hit finish. Now, the next thing we need to do, though, once we've built, we've got our fragment here, the first thing we need to do is we don't want to extend a fragment because we're not creating a regular fragment. Rather, we are creating a dialogue fragment. Now, notice when I choose dialogue fragment here, there are 2 in the list, Android.app and Android.support. Make sure you're choosing Android.support. We do not want to use, Android.support.v4.app. Don't choose Android.app. It will be deprecated later this year. Everything should be used from the support library because, again, we don't want it to be tied to internals of the operating system. We want similar experiences across all our devices, and the support library is going to create that ability for us. Okay, so this gives us our basic structure for our dialog fragment. So now we need to start implementing the actual dialogue itself, because right now really it's nothing different than an actual fragment like we've done in the past. And we're going to do this by implementing a couple of methods we haven't done otherwise. So let's come in here and we are going to generate. We're going to override. And we want to override the create dialog method. Okay? Because that's what's going to be, that's the whole point of this thing, is creating a dialog now rather than creating a view. Okay, this onCreate dialog, this is a new lifecycle event that's going to be tied specifically because now we're dealing with a dialog fragment rather than just a generic fragment as we've done in the past. So this method will be triggered whenever we're creating the dialog itself. Now dialogs that are built by using a dialog builder. Okay, so we're going to come past this guy down here and we're going to choose alert dialog because that's the type of dialog we're building. Here's an alert. So in the alert dialog, I need access to the builder. Okay, I need access to the factory that's going to know how to build these things. So let's call this builder equals new alert dialog builder. Now, if we're since we're inside of a fragment here, we're going to need to get reference to the activity for this fragment to be attached to. Now it needs the activity because it needs to be able to put this thing on top of everything else. Okay, our scrim needs to be attached to the activity, not just to the fragment. We got to get high enough up that it can be attached that way, as well as we want it to be tied to the life cycles of the activity to which this dialog is being created. Okay, now inside the builder is going to allow us to set the options of the dialog, and then we will build it from there. So we can set a message. We can choose a positive button, a negative button. We can also set a neutral button, and then we will create it. At a minimum, though, we really should set a message, a positive, a negative, and then go ahead and create the fragment from there. So this is fairly easily done. So if we come to our... sorry, I had to zoom my notes up. I can't read them, and I don't want to have a typo here in my code. So we've got our builder. Okay. So once we have our builder, now we can use that builder. So builder.set message, for example. And then we can now give it a string resource as best practice, or a character sequence. So for example, if we wanted to say our message is this image cannot be recovered if deleted. We can also now use Alt-Enter to extract that string resource. Delete warning. And now that will pass it to our string. Now it's going to complain it doesn't exist yet because this code is incomplete. So it can't compile properly, so R won't exist as we would normally expect. Okay, we can now set our positive button, for example. Again, give it a piece of text that we want to do. So let's say delete, and we can extract that out here in just a second. Because it needs a text, and then it will need now a new dialog interface, a new anonymous class for our onClick listener. Okay, we can come in here and we can extract the string resource again. Okay, a little bit faster than having to go through and make all of our strings at first. You know, if you prefer to make your strings at first and then come in and apply them, either way is up to you. When the user clicks it, do your deletion logic. okay, which oftentimes is sending a message to some other thing that's capable of doing it. We can set our negative button. Again, the same process. Cancel. New. Okay, and extract our resource. Oops. There we go. Okay. And then now, rather than returning the super version, because we've handled it, we want to actually give it back now. Notice it wants an actual dialog. So we are going to return our builder dot create. Okay. So as what we're doing is we're following a design pattern known as the factory pattern. Okay. Where we have a factory, our builder, that knows how to construct a dialog that our dialog fragment is going to need to work with. So this builder, though, needs to know, okay, well, do you want, so for example, if you were to build a car, maybe, are you building a, I've been wanting a truck really bad, so I want an F-150. Okay, do I want a STX? I want to go cheap work truck that has nothing in it. Do I want to go platinum that's got, that's $70,000 and completely loaded? Maybe I want to go to a Raptor that's really loaded out and I can go four-wheeling like crazy with it. Would be epic. I'll never afford it, but it's epic, right? I got to tell when I'm ordering this truck which way do I want to go, okay? Or do I want red paint or I want blue paint? I want white paint. I want silver. I want leather. I want cloth. I want a diesel engine or I want a gas engine. I want turbos. I want a V6. I want a V8. Whatever options are necessary for the factory to correctly create your thing, right? We're going to provide those options, which is what we're doing here in our builder by setting a message, by setting a negative button, a positive button, all of those different pieces, and they're just chained together. It can be done as independent calls to it as well. The industry convention is to chain them together. It's a little bit more efficient on the computer to process. It's a little bit faster, or actually the device to process, a little bit less painful for memory to chain them together, which is why you'll often see them like this. So then we're going to once we've given all of our extra changes or extra things we want to have happen to our method or to our dialog fragment, we're going to then ask our builder to go ahead and build it to create the thing that it's designed to build, which is the job again of the factory pattern, which is a dialog. So our builder will return a dialog back to us to work with. In this case, the thing it's returning it to is the method that called onCreateDialog that's handling that life cycle of showing it. Okay, so we have a dialog here. Now we need to wire it up to our UI so we can show that dialog to our users. It's fairly easily done. Again, let's come back into our main activity. In fact, why don't we have a button? In fact, let's change this guy out. Instead of having a text view there, which is dumb, let's change now to have a button. ID. I'm going to call this guy BTN show. And we want to set a, not title, some text here. Whoa. What the heck is this thing doing? Let's try that again here. There we go. Okay, good. We're playing nicely now. Show dialog. Right? Or this could happen, say for example, if you wanted to have it happen inside of the user maybe we had a delete option in your menu. Again, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to put a button here so we can connect the pieces and you can see that. Extract myself a string resource. Okay? And we're going to wire it up. Just like we've done every time in the past. Button, btn, show, button, find view by ID, r.id.button. Oops, what do we call it? BTN show. Dot set on click listener view view on click listener. Here we go. Okay, so wherever it is you want to have this thing, this dialog show up, we now can just come in here and we can construct an instance of it. So delete confirmation dialog fragment. Just call it dialog for short equals new. Construct an instance of it. That way, if you had any other extra things you needed to add to it, we can then choose now, for example, as I mentioned, whether the user is going to be forced to make a decision or not. So that's through an attribute called cancelable. So in this case, I can enforce the user. Okay, I can tell them it's not cancelable, and then we'll use frag. Dialog dot show. Okay. Now the dialog needs an access to a fragment manager because again it's a fragment. So in this case we'll give it the support fragment manager because it is a support based dialog fragment as we talked about using the support library. So therefore it needs the support manager. That cannot be null. That's the @not-null annotation we have there. And then let's give it a tag so we can find that fragment again if we need to. Let's call this delete dialog. We can save it, and then now we can run it. And that will launch our dialog for us. Wow, the build is taking forever on this computer today. Sorry, y'all. I'm sure you wanted to sit and stare at my PC building very slowly. I don't know why. I've got 24 gigs of RAM, but it is just taking its sweet time. There we go. Installing APKs, and there we go. Now I can choose Show Dialog. Ooh, and we get a crash. Excellent. Let's look at some debugging. So if we come over here to our logcat, let's see what happened. If we come up here, all right, fatal exception. Request feature must be called before adding content. I'm not calling request feature. Let's see. Okay, I figured out what it is. We missed a step. Sorry, I apologize for that. When we made our dialog fragment, okay, we forgot when I put in the onCreate dialog lifecycle here, I forgot to comment out the onCreate view. We don't need it here because the fragment is going to be managing the view for us. Now we can use custom views, but that's again a much more advanced topic for us to get into. So now, let's try it again. Let's push play and hope it doesn't explode in our face. We want to let the dialog fragment manage everything related to the view because we're using an alert dialog with positive and negative buttons. And we can choose to show dialog. There we go. And now our dialog's popped up. You can see our scrim. That's how everything grayed out before. Our dialog is lifted up. Notice how it feels like it's coming off of the screen now with some elevation there. That's 24 dps by default. And we can apply... and the advantage is if you've applied theming now too, this will be smart enough to pick up from theming, you know, the colors of buttons, text sizes and image, you know, things like that. So there's a lot of advantage to using theming, even though it can be a giant pain in the neck. Later on, gives you a lot more flexibility. But notice I can't, when I click this scrim out here, my dialog won't go away because I'm forcing my user to make a decision, one way or the other. Now this is coming from where I said cancelable. Now if I want to set cancelable, for example, to true, what this is going to do is this is going to allow our user, once this finishes building here, to click inside that gray instead. And notice my dialog goes away when I click inside the scrim because I'm not forcing them to make a decision. You know, that's useful in cases where we want to just, you know, make the or give them the option to make a decision, but if they decide, you know what, never mind, I can click outside of it and it's going to provide a cancel as well. If I don't want to force them to make a choice between these things, I want to allow them to just abort the decision altogether. That's a possibility as well. Okay? And So I think that wraps up everything related to dialogues. Again, as always, if you've got questions, make sure to throw those out in the discussions. And then in our next video, I will walk through table layouts and countdown timers. See you online.